Well, good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to be here with you all. Have you heard the one about two prophets, a lion and a donkey? That actually became my standard response between 2011 and 2016 when anyone asked me what I was doing, what I was studying for my PhD. It became sort of an in-joke among my friends. But as I repeated it over and over in jest to people, I actually started to think, it's not a bad question. On one hand, have you actually heard the story that's in 1 Kings 13? Because it's a bizarre one, and it's the sort of text that, quite frankly, we sometimes avoid. We're reading along, and then we come to something like this, and we just, what's next? We skip over. But on the other hand, I am interested in whether you have heard, whether you've really heard, for all that it has to say, the one about two prophets, a lion and a donkey. Karl Barth was a big part of my dissertation, and he spoke a lot about the importance of hearing biblical texts. And what he meant by that, all of Barth's contemporaries, were back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, they saw the text as a lens, right? So they were very much using the biblical text as a way to reach through to the historical world behind it. And so the text really served a function of how do we study the historical world behind the text, because that's what's really interesting, that's what's really exciting. And the text became a kind of lens for that reaching through. Now, Barth wasn't into that. He said, look, it's all right to do that study, to look at the historical world behind the text. But he said, don't stop there. Start there. He said that should create some questions and get you going. But it's the world of the text. And he brought the attention back to the text. And he died in 1968. But in the 70s, something began called the literary turn in biblical studies. And it was really a shift of focus from that world behind the text to the text itself. And now over the last 40, 50 years, there's been a lot of other shifts. And now, in our postmodern milieu, we're looking at the world in front of the text. So there are these three worlds, if you like. And Barth really brought the attention back to the Bible in a way. But 1 Kings 13, it's an incredible narrative, isn't it? Yeah. Really draws us in. It's intriguing. Now, I'm seeing by the semi-blank look on some of your faces that you haven't read it. You didn't read it before you came tonight. Right. And I see people reaching for their Bibles. Don't do that. No need to read it right now. It's okay. We're going to go through it in some detail. And if you haven't ever read it, you should still get a decent sense of what it's saying. But first, let me tell you what I want to do tonight. Because if you're not interested in what I have to say now, there are about 27,000 theological books out there that you could go and entertain yourself with. So let me give you a sense of what I want to do. My main goal tonight is really to take a difficult text, a strange one perhaps, and to draw meaning from it. Contemporary, relevant stuff for today, hopefully by the end of the night. But along the way, I don't just want to do that for you in a way that you say, oh, that was interesting, but I don't think I could do that for myself. I'm really interested in trying to give you some tools so that you could go away and maybe with a difficult text that you're reading at the moment or have read recently, that you could apply some of these skills. So that's really where I want to go. The first question, the very first question we ought to ask whenever we read the Bible is,
What am I reading?
oh, good. Some students here who've picked up a few things. The very first question we ask, all of you, when we pick up the Bible is, what am I reading? Now, the reason that's an important question is different texts should be read differently, right? They shouldn't all be read the same way. But very often we pick up the Bible and we just think it's the Bible. So I've got to read it as a sacred text that means what it says and so on. But if my wife was to write me a poem, which is unlikely, but, oh, this is being recorded. It's very likely. If she was to write me a poem when I was away or something and it said, my heart aches, my heart is bursting because I need to see you. I wouldn't call an ambulance, would I? But why wouldn't I call an ambulance? Oh, she's using a metaphor. So I would have to understand that the language that she's using is poetic and metaphorical and so on, and not take her literally, as we might say. In my office back there, I'm ashamed to say there's a speeding fine sitting just to the side. I've been putting off paying it for a few weeks now, but I finally got round to it. It has a certain number on it, the amount of money that I've got to pay up for speeding. Now, can I interpret that? Can I just halve that and say, hey, open to interpretation, says 160, but I thought 80 would do. It's a literary form, a genre that I have to pay attention to, right? And if it asks for a certain amount, I've got to hand over that amount. So we have to know what we're reading, because what we're reading determines what we look for and how we read it. Now, if I'm reading poetry, I'm going to look for things like wordplay. Where are the words playing off each other, maybe sounding similar, maybe having more than one meaning and so on. Alliteration, rhyme, meter, looking for word pairs, metaphor, symbolism. And if I find all these things, it just confirms to me that I'm reading poetry. And it helps me to understand what I'm reading. Tonight we're looking at narrative, so we're going to be looking for these things. Character, or who are the characters? And there are lots of characters in 1 Kings 13. We're looking at dialogue. We're looking at plot, by which I mean the action, the way that the scenes unfold. We're looking at the narrator, now and then. Does the narrator help us to understand what's being said? What key words are there here that are repeated? What's the structure of the whole story? And then I'm looking for references to time and space, because those are all important when you're reading narrative. Now, we're going to use that list tonight as we go through the text, just to give you something to hang everything on. So let's consider our cast first up, in order of appearance. We've got, at the beginning, Jeroboam, the king. The man of God from Judah turns up, the Lord. Josiah is mentioned in a prophecy. We have the old Bethel prophet and his sons. Then, of course, we have the lion and the donkey. And finally, the people as a collective character. And then finally, Josiah will show up later on. So all of these are different characters, and they will all play different parts. Something we need to understand about characters is they can either be flat or round. Now, do you know what I mean by that? In literary theory, we talk about a flat character or a round one. A flat one isn't that interesting, right? They've just got one or two features, and that makes them serve their purpose in the story. Goliath, he's pretty flat. We know that he's the baddie, right? He's big and bad. So he's saying bad things about David and about Israel, and he's insulting and he's rude, but we don't really need to know what's motivating him. We don't need to know if he's had a bad sort of childhood and got bullied, and so he took to steroids and now he's huge and so on. We don't need to know that. But David, on the other hand, is a very round character. And I don't mean that he loves pastries, although he may well have done. David is round in the sense that sometimes he's driven by godly desires and he shows a really wonderful character. Other times he's driven by lust or by anger and rage. He's a musician, we know that about him, and that's interesting. But on the other hand, he's actually quite a valiant warrior. So we see this complexity to David, and it makes him very interesting. One of the ways that characters are made more round, other than the pastries, is that the narrator discusses their motives, or at least invites you or compels you to think, what is motivating this person? And that's one of the big questions. For those of you who did read 1 Kings 13 before you came tonight, one of the big questions here is the old Bethel prophet. Why does he pursue the other prophet, the young man from Judah? And why does he try to trick him into disobeying the laws that God has given him, these 3 commands? What's his motive? Why is he doing that? We're not told. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of our characters here are round and some of them are flat. Right, moving on to dialogue. Dialogue is... Oh, just lost my notes here. Sorry, I've gone way ahead of my notes. We'll see a lot of dialogue in this passage, a lot of conversation. And I don't really need to say much about it. We know how dialogue works. But there is one convention in Hebrew narrative that is important, I think, to understand. And that is, in Hebrew narrative, you only ever have dialogue between two characters or parties at once. You never have sort of a conversation with 3 or 4 people all pitching in, right? So a character could be a group of people, like in 1 Samuel 8, Samuel has a conversation with the elders and then with the people, but they're still presented as a single party. Why does this matter? Why am I telling you this? Well, sometimes our conventions are different. So I'm sure you guys watch TV or read books or see that we, in our Western culture in the 21st century, we may be watching a play or at the theatre or a film that has a number of people pitching in and having a conversation. But when we read that onto the Bible, it's sometimes unhelpful. Let me give you an example. In Genesis 3, I sometimes hear people ask the question, why, when the serpent is tempting Eve, right, why is Adam just standing there? Have you ever heard anyone ask that? And I've heard lots of interesting theories about why Adam is just standing there silent. We don't hear anything from him. But really, the simplest answer to why Adam is silent is that that's the way Hebrew narrative works. You don't have a conversation between 3 people at once. So if you think about it, Eve is talking to the serpent, and then Eve talks to Adam, and they have a conversation, and she passes him the fruit or whatever. And then God comes along, and God speaks to the man, and he points at Eve. And God has a conversation with Eve, and she points at the snake, and then God spells out the curses. And he does that in 3 one-to-one dialogues. He speaks to the snake, and then to Eve, and then to the man. And so we get all these separate conversations going, and it's quite complex, but it's never more than 2 parties chatting at one time. And it's just important that we don't draw theology from that, because you can imagine some of the things people say about Adam, poor guy. There's only one narrative I know of in the whole Old Testament that breaks that rule. And ironically, it's because 2 people are chatting and someone interrupts. And they interrupt the protocols of narrative too. So dialogue, like action, is used to develop characters. So we're wondering if this character is round. We listen to the things that they say. We watch the things that they do. And we have to pay attention, very close attention, when people are talking. Because if God has told someone to do something, and he's given them 3 instructions, and they follow 2 of them, or they pass 2 of those things on, then we're invited to ask what happened to the 3rd. All right, now plot. This is where we need to start to look at the story. By plot, I simply mean the action, the unfolding of the scenes. And I've split the story into 6 scenes, which will give us a sense of what's happening in 1 Kings 13. Now, is everyone following everything so far? Yep? Okay. Now, the basic sequence of events in this first scene are that the man of God rocks up and he comes to confront Jeroboam, his idolatrous practices, because Jeroboam has created this altar and he's about to offer a sacrifice on it. And we get a power play between the man of God and between the king, with the king, and the man of God clearly comes off on top. He has the upper hand. The king sees the man of God's power displayed in 2 signs. The altar falls apart when he prophesies against it. And when the king sees him and reaches out to arrest him, his hand withers. And so there are 2 displays of power there that show that the man of God has the upper hand. Now, when the king sees that the man of God has this power on side, he asks him home for lunch, as you do. whoa, I was planning to arrest you, but now that you've healed my hand and you've got this great power inside, how would you like to have lunch? And he offers him a gift. And at this point, we discover something that is central to the whole plot, to the whole story. And that is, the man of God has come to Bethel under a threefold commandment, right? He says, I can't have lunch with you because the Lord has told me I can't eat any food here, I can't have anything to drink here, and I've got to return by a different way than what I came. I can't go back the same way. Now, we can talk about those things later because those three things are all very interesting. I believe there'll be a time for question and answer at the end, so hold on to that if you want to talk further about that. So the man of God says, nope, not having lunch with you, Jeroboam. The lights dim, the curtains fall, and that's the end of scene 1. And we've established equilibrium. And that's usually what happens in the opening scene. The opening scene of a film, of a TV series, of a book, equilibrium is established. Now, all I mean by that is that the man of God has come in the name of the Lord and he stood firm. He has spoken against Jeroboam's idolatrous practices. The baddie has been bad and the goodie has been good, right? It's quite simple. And so as we're sitting here in the dark waiting for the second scene, feeling satisfied because all is well with the world and as it should be, the lights come on and we're in the second scene. The curtain rises and we're now in the house of another prophet for scene 2. Now here we have another prophet, an older prophet, who lives in Bethel. And as we listen, his sons come bursting in the door. Dad, you should have seen what happened today. Jeroboam he had this brand new altar and he was about to offer a sacrifice. And then this dude just rocks up and he curses it and it falls to the ground and it just collapses. And Dad, Jeroboam wasn't very happy about that. And he stretched out his arm and he said, seize him. Yeah, when he said seize him, his arm withered. And Jeroboam wasn't very happy about that, so he asked the guy to pray for him, and the guy did pray for him, and when he did pray for him, his arm got better. And then Jeroboam said, would you come home for lunch? And he said, no, I can't, because I can't eat food here. God told me I can't eat food here. I can't have a drink here. I've got to go back the same way that I came. And then he was gone. And the father says, well, which way did he go? And the boys say, that way. Well, saddle a donkey for me. And so here, the plot thickens, right? Now, why and how does the plot thicken? Well, we've got this tension because we've now got a second prophet in the story. And the second prophet appears to have a desire to set out and find the first prophet and make him disobey the command. Now, his sons have told him what happened in Bethel, and it's actually quite specific if you read it. It says that they told him exactly what the man of God had said to the king. So, he sets out on his donkey, he finds him sitting under a tree, he establishes who he is. Are you the man of God who came from Judah? Yes, I am. And so he says, do you want to come back to my place? Have some lunch. And the man of God responds as we expect him to and hope that he will. He says, no can do. I'm under this threefold commandment. And he gives the same rationale, right? But then the Bethel prophet seems to show something of his true colours. He says, listen, mate, I'm a prophet, like you're a prophet. We're the same. And look, an angel of the Lord told me that you can come back to my house. And you can eat food. And you can have a drink. Now, at this point, we're confused. And I can see a little bit of that. And that's okay. Because we've got two prophets, two different words of the Lord. Who do we trust? Right? How do we know? How do we discern what's going on here? Well, at this point, we just need to take a little break and look at narrators. What is the role of a narrator? The narrator's basic job, is to tell the story and just stay out of sight. Yeah? The story should get told fairly naturally through the dialogue and the plot and the action and so on unfolding. So the best thing for the narrator to do is stay in the background. Occasionally, narrators poke their heads out and they will tell you something about the thoughts or the feelings or the motives of a character. So in Genesis 6, we read that God was grieved that he'd made people because the thoughts of their minds are only ever sinful all the time. And we could ask ourselves, how does the narrator know that God's stricken to his heart and grieved? Or in the chapter before this one, in 1 Kings 12, Jeroboam thinks to himself, or as it says in the Hebrew, he quite literally says in his heart, if these people, my people, keep going to Jerusalem to worship, I'm going to lose them, right? They're going to kill me off and they're just going to give their loyalty to someone else. And so the narrator gives us his motive for shaping these 2 golden calves. And Jeroboam says, you don't need to go to Jerusalem anymore. Just come and worship here. Makes God more accessible to them. And we could ask, how does the narrator know what Jeroboam is saying in his heart or in his mind? Now, at the end of the day, we could have a discussion about that, but at the end of the day, the narrator is omniscient. Okay, the narrator tells the story, and this is the case in anything. You have to trust the narrator. If you can't trust the narrator, well, you can't really have a story. You're questioning everything that happens. So in some ways, a Christian belief in inspiration is our trust in the narrator when we're reading narrative anyway, and story. We have to believe that what they're saying is right. And so the narrator will step out of the shadows just for a moment and clear things up. And when things get confusing, the narrator does that. So in this situation where we've got these 2 prophets, 2 alternative words, and we're not quite sure who to trust, the narrator does poke his head out, cups his hand towards the audience, and at the end of verse 18 he says, but he was deceiving him. So at this point we know that the old prophet from Bethel is the trickster, and the man of God is the one we can trust. He has come to do the right thing, and so far he has been doing a pretty good job.
Excuse me, Paul, are you going to address authorship or source?
No. So that's a good question. Authorship and his source and that sort of thing, but that's precisely what I was talking about at the start, that reaching through the text to the historical world behind it. And I really want to show you some literary skills for reading the text and getting into the world of the text. But you can certainly ask questions about that later. I've certainly read around that quite a bit and happy to chat about it. So next comes scene 3. We'll go back from the narrator to scene 3. Scene 1 established the equilibrium. Man of God is under a 3-fold command and he's keeping it. Scene 2 disrupted it and introduced some tension. Because the last line in scene 2 is, then the man of God went back with him, ate food, and drank water in his house. He's broken all 3 parts of this command. Scene 3 develops the tension. So this time as the curtains are pulled back on scene 3, we see both prophets sitting together at a table. A prohibited fellowship. They were never supposed to do this, and this is how we see them. Dim light, they're sitting there at a shared table. Exactly what the man of God was not supposed to do. And it's quite awkward, isn't it? I find this scene almost comical because the Bethel prophet, the one who has just lied to his younger colleague, he now receives a genuine word from the Lord. And he has to say to him across this table of fellowship, hey, listen, because you came back with me to my house and you ate all the Tim Tams that I put out and the Milo that was there, well, that's all gone too. You're not going to make it back to Judah alive. And he has to tell him this, and it's a genuine word from the Lord, which is also confusing, right? Because this guy's been deceitful, but now he receives a word from the Lord, and the narrator doesn't say anything about it. And we see that it is fulfilled. So we're in a bit of an awkward situation here, because sure enough, the man of God, he finishes his meal, it says, he gets up, he walks out, and he's met by a lion and killed by the lion. Now, in some sense, it's not really that surprising that he dies, because we know that he was given a command and he broke it in full. It's how he dies that's weird. A lion comes, presumably knocks him off the donkey and kills him, but doesn't eat him, just kills him. And there's a perfectly, I presume, perfectly tasty donkey there as well, but he doesn't even kill the donkey. In fact, the icing on the cake here is that the lion and the donkey stand together side by side over the corpse of the man of God, like two silent sentinels just guarding his body. Okay, so this is where the story gets quite unusual, quite weird. And it seems to me that the last verse in this scene, in scene 3, verse 25, is hardly necessary. It seems to state the obvious, but by doing so, the narrator is again raising his voice from the darkness to tell us why the unlion-like lion behaved the way that he did. This is verse 25. People passed by and saw the body thrown in the road, with the lion standing by the body, and they came and told it in the town where the old prophet lived. Well, of course they did. Of course they did. If you saw something like that, you wouldn't say, that's interesting, but I got to get to Woolies, right? I've got to get my shopping done. You would look twice, you'd rub your eyes, and then you'd text everyone you know or call them and say, get here now. There's a lion and a donkey standing side by side over a dead body, and they're not doing anything. They're just standing there. And so we'll see later that actually part of the point, I think, of the lion and the donkey standing there is to draw attention. It's the spectacle. Because word gets around and word gets back to Jeroboam, and we'll see what he does about it. So, the man of God has broken the threefold commandment and paid for it with his life. And what does that demonstrate? If not, that he was truly sent by God in the first place. End of scene 3. In scene 4, we're back in the old prophet's house. He hears what everyone's talking about. He hears the talk of the town, and he offers up a clear explanation of what has happened. For anyone who's listening, but especially for us as readers, right? This is what he says. It is the man of God who disobeyed the word of the Lord. Therefore the Lord has given him to the lion, which has torn him and killed him, according to the word of the Lord that the Lord spoke to him. And so he hops onto a second donkey and sets off to find the man of God. I have heard that donkeys were like Mercedes-Benz cars in the ancient world. So maybe this old prophet, he had some cash. Because he's now on his second donkey and setting out to find the man of God. That's free, that one. That's just a little fun fact for you. He lays the man of God's corpse over his donkey, returns to Bethel, puts the corpse into his own grave, and mourns over him with the words, "Alas, my brother." So he feels some connection. Does he only now recognise him as a genuine prophet, or do you think he knew all along? It's a gap. A gap in the narrative is something that is left open for us to ponder. Sometimes the narrator fills the gap later on. Sometimes it's just left wide open. In any case, he asks to be buried with the man of God when he dies. Why? Because he believes that the man of God's prophecy from the beginning that he spoke to Jeroboam will come to pass. And do you remember what he prophesied? He said that human bones will be burnt on this altar that Jeroboam has built. And when that happens, the old Bethel prophet wants his bones to be lying beside the bones of the man of God. Unusual logic, but there you go. The final scene in 1 Kings 13, scene 5, is brief. And we're back where we started. Jeroboam's idolatrous altar in Bethel. No words are spoken by the characters, so there's no action here. It's just a report from the narrator at the end. Only the narrator speaks to tell us that King Jeroboam is completely unaffected by any of what has happened. But the narrator does suggest, it seems, that Jeroboam should have been affected by what has happened. He says, even after this event, even after this thing, Jeroboam did not turn away from his evil way. He's back at his old antics. He's appointing anyone who puts their hand up to be a priest, even though Deuteronomy 18 specifically says that that's for the Levites. So he doesn't have a Levitical priesthood. He's got anyone who wants to be a priest, he's appointing them as a priest. So in spite of the two miraculous signs that the man of God did, tearing down this altar, which he's presumably rebuilt, and his own hand withering up when he tried to arrest him, it doesn't make any difference to Jeroboam. And so towards the end of the story, the Bethel prophet publicly affirms the prophecy from the man of God. And he actually adds to it. He says, Josiah will come one day and he will tear down this altar and all the altars in Samaria. And he adds that to it. But it doesn't make any difference for Jeroboam, who carries on as if nothing has happened. And so that's it for him. The final verse seals his fate. It says this matter, this priesthood presumably, this false worship, became sin to the house of Jeroboam so as to cut it off and destroy it from the face of the earth. And Jeroboam, he's not seen in a very positive light. For the rest of the book of Kings, 22 more references are made back to the sin of Jeroboam that he caused Israel to commit. So again and again in the history, it just keeps referring to the fact that he caused the whole nation to just keep sinning, right up until Josiah does come along. Now that's the end of 1 Kings 13, but I did say that there were 6 scenes, didn't I? Now it may surprise you, but there's another scene. It's not part of this. It's not in 1 Kings 13. And you know that every good story has a twist, right? Just as you start to relax, everything's resolved. Oh, there it is. Something else grabs you by surprise. Now, you have to wait 300 years for this twist, okay? So it's not just around the corner. But the story's not over yet. So 300 years later, some of the loose ends that are left dangling at the end of 1 Kings 13 are tied up. You have to go all the way to 2 Kings 23, verses 15 to 20 to get to the epilogue. But let me describe that to you. This is King Josiah's time, okay? So this is the king that was prophesied. King Josiah arrives in Bethel. Now he's been on a rampage throughout Israel and Judah, tearing down false places of worship. Josiah is arguably the best king that Israel ever had. And he's on a mission to get rid of false places of worship. And he arrives in Bethel, and like every other altar that he's found, a false place of worship, he tears it down. And just as the man of God predicted, Josiah takes bones from the tombs around and he defiles the altar by burning human bones on it. He's defiling this false place of worship. Now, as he's doing this, Josiah isn't aware that he's fulfilling a prophecy. He sees this monument and he says to someone, "What's that monument?" And they say to him, "Oh, that's the tomb of the man of God from Judah who prophesied that you would do what you're doing now." And so Josiah says, "Well, let's leave that one alone." And they leave the man of God's tomb alone, which has the man of God's bones in it and the old Bethel prophet's bones in it. So those two skeletons, or what's left of them, are left alone. And so the tale concludes with 2 prophecies being fulfilled. The man of God's prophecy that Josiah would come from Judah and he would defile this false place of worship, and the old Bethel prophet's addition to that prophecy, that he would also do this to all the high places in all the cities of Samaria. So all of that is fulfilled. What a lovely ending. 2 skeletons lying side by side in a grave together, where the bones of one protect the bones of the other from being dug up and defiled. Okay, so we've considered the characters. We've seen a lot of dialogue. We've covered the plot's twists and turns, and we've noticed where the narrator pokes his head out from behind the curtain to make certain points. But I still feel like we're missing something. Don't you? Is this all making good sense to you now? You feel satisfied? Or is there more? There's more. Oh, who needs to die? Oh, Jeroboam, he died 300 years ago. But the story is certainly interesting. It's fascinating. Its twists and turns they take our interest. But what does it all mean? And why, I think more importantly, why is it here? And I think that question is actually one of the questions that will really help us to make sense of this. So let's take a quick look at the next thing, which is structure. Literary structure, okay? So we just look around 1 Kings 13 for some clues about how to interpret 1 Kings 13. In 1 Kings 11, 1 to 11 are all about Solomon. 1 Kings 11, Solomon is committing idolatry in a pretty serious way. You know that he's got 300 wives, 700 concubines, and of course they're all saying, "Oh, Solomon, can I have a place of worship for my gods?" And he says, "Yeah, sure you can. You can have that hill over there." I'm not sure if he had an American accent. Sorry, John. But he panders to their wants, and there are false places of worship everywhere, okay? And that's one of the ways that he's really gone wrong. So God speaks to Solomon and says, "I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you because of all this idolatry." Now, Solomon, as you know, very wealthy, very wise. He's making political alliances through these marriages and no doubt adding to his wealth. But God is very unhappy about the fact that he has created these things called Bama, high places, false places of worship. So God says, "I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you, most of it. I'll give 1 part to your son, Rehoboam, but 10 parts to Jeroboam." Okay, now in 1 Kings 12, the next chapter, we're introduced to Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, and Jeroboam. So Rehoboam will be in the south, in Judah, where Solomon was, and Jeroboam gets given the majority of Israel in the north, and the kingdom is divided. And in 1 Kings 12, these two are almost at war with each other, because the kingdom has been divided, and of course neither of them want a divided kingdom. They want all of the kingdom. And so Shemaiah, a man of God, steps in and says, "This is the Lord's will. The Lord has divided the kingdom, don't fight." And they don't fight. Then we get to 1 Kings 13, and we ask, wait, everything made sense historically, and there was a flow to this. And now we've got this story about 2 anonymous prophets. And so we have to ask what's going on. And I think it's a good question. Why are they anonymous? Because actually there's a whole bunch of prophets around here. We've got Ahijah in this chapter. We've got Shemaiah here. And when we get down to 1 Kings 14, Ahijah's back. So they're named. There's nothing wrong with naming prophets. It would help us to know who we're talking about. And Elijah and Elisha, they're not far away. But these 2 are anonymous. And it just so happens that they're from north and south. And they're in tension. The plot starts to thicken. What's going on here? There seems to be something at work in the fact that just as the kingdom is divided, we get this strange story about a prophet from the north and a prophet from the south in opposition to one another. Then when we get to 1 Kings 14, we hear a prophecy about the fact that both nations are going to go into exile. In fact, it's suggested here by Ahijah that Israel will lead Judah astray as a nation, and that they will both end up in the shared fate of being in exile, in the same grave, you might say. Okay, so this is starting to make a little bit more sense. Well, is it? It piques my interest anyway. So these 2 kings, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, are in tension with one another. If we turn the scroll the other way and have a look at the literary structure from a larger point of view, we noted that 1 Kings 13 has its conclusion in 2 Kings 23. That there's about a 300-year gap here. And what's interesting is that these 2, the beginning and the end of this same story, sort of provide bookends to the whole history of the divided kingdom. So we have a story whose introduction and epilogue or ending begin and close this whole history of division. Okay, this is the pattern we're seeing. Northern Israel The sins of Jeroboam, which are mentioned 22 times, the old Bethel prophet. That's all in the north, when we take all of this literature together. In the south, we've got Judah, we've got the reforms of Josiah, and we've got the man of God from Judah. Both of these kings are mentioned in 1 Kings 13. Arguably the worst king that Israel ever had, led the whole nation astray. Arguably the best king that Judah ever had. Why? Because he undid the sins of Jeroboam. The sins of Jeroboam caused the division between Israel and Judah. Josiah comes along and he gets rid of it all. He undoes those sins. And it looks like something wonderful will happen in Josiah's time. But he dies an untimely death. Not unlike the man of God from Judah. So we have these two kings, they're set against each other, right? In the narrative. They're 300 years apart, but they're set against one another. They're both mentioned, by the way, in 1 Kings 13, and they're both mentioned in 2 Kings 23. And they're represented by these prophets from north and south who are unnamed, who are representative figures. So what happens to the kingdoms, in one sense, has already happened in the lives of these two prophets in this story. What happens in the history of the kingdoms is that both of them end up exiled because of their sin. And that's exactly what happened in 1 Kings 13. Both prophets end up sharing the same fate. As I said, you could say that they end up in a shared grave. So this story that at first it sounds so strange when you read it by itself, but you put it into a larger context and we start to see that maybe it's a really creative way of writing history. It's kind of a cross between perhaps an enacted parable and a prophecy. And it tells us from the outset, as soon as Israel and Judah are divided, that they're doomed, they're destined for exile. What hope is there for God's people? Well, let's look a bit beyond the book of Kings, because the book of Kings doesn't have a lot of hope at the end. In Ezekiel 37, now you know Ezekiel is sent off into exile. He's from a priestly family, but he's a prophet. He says this, just after the valley of the dry bones, that prophecy in Ezekiel 37. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be over them all. Never again shall they be two nations. Never again shall they be divided into two kingdoms. They shall never again defile themselves with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions. I will save them from all the apostasies into which they've fallen, and will cleanse them. Then they shall be my people, and I will be their God. This phrase appears again and again throughout Scripture. It's what God has always wanted for his people. I'll be their God, they will be my people. And this is really where it comes to the crunch. Because a talk like this might be interesting, might be fascinating to look at the ancient world and to look at a text that's a couple thousand years old. And I hope it is interesting in some way, but what does it really matter? What does any of this really matter for us living in the 21st century? At some point we need to remind ourselves, I think, that we're not just reading some ancient document that's been very cleverly put together, which it has. We're reading a book that directs us to Christ. And in fact, let me just show you another couple of references. Because like the sons of the Bethel prophet, right? When he asks, and they say he went that way. A lot of these strange stories in the Old Testament, they direct us to the man of God from Judah. And on a number of occasions in the New Testament, Jesus, a man of God from Judah, he encourages us to look for him in the pages of the Old Testament. So we have in John, for instance, you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. And it is they that testify on my behalf. Yet you refuse to come to me to have life. A few verses later he says, if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. And we think, wow, that's a strong claim, Jesus. Perhaps the best known example of this is Luke 24, the road to Emmaus. Right? Jesus is walking along the road with disciples of his after the crucifixion, and they've lost all hope. They say, we thought this guy was the one. We thought he was going to be, the Messiah. And Jesus explains to them that his death was necessary. It was necessary for me to suffer, that it had to happen. But to make that point, it always surprises me that he doesn't say to them, you've been hanging out with me for 3 years, and I've been saying this to you again and again. Don't you remember? No, he goes back to the scriptures, to what we would call the Old Testament. And he explains that his suffering was necessary by referring to Moses and all the prophets, which is a way of saying the whole Old Testament. And I find this amazing. Beginning with the Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. So what's suggested here, or what's actually stated outright, is that we can find Jesus in all of the scriptures. So I actually don't think, as I finish now, I don't think that I've lost my bearings in doing the task of interpretation when I say that 1 Kings 13 reminds us that another man of God from Judah would die an untimely death, an unfair death, and invite us to share his grave and be preserved from exile. For if we've been united with him in death, in a death like his, we will also be united with him in a resurrection like his. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.